Hello, welcome. Thank you for being here. In this video, we're going to talk about what hybrid training is and what hybrid training is not. As this is a term and a type of training that really has expanded in popularity over the past number of years. I think largely because Jack Dudes running shirtless makes for a pretty aesthetic Instagram reel. But I do think that the way hybrid training is often displayed and characterized across social media and related platforms is a bit inaccurate in regard to what it was meant to be. So if this is something that you have ever found yourself interested in, I'm hoping this video gives you a bit better idea as to what it is, so you have a bit better idea as to if it's something you want to pursue in more detail. So from a bird's eye view, this is sort of my plan for this video. A lot of the bulk, I would say, we're going to cover in this first point. These relating points are a couple, let's say, frequently asked questions that I thought would be worthy to add in this video just for the sake of completeness. So one thing that I want to start off first with is kind of, paying some credit to the guy who really coined the term hybrid training, hybrid athlete, all this sort of stuff, which is Alex Viada right here. If you're interested in this kind of stuff, I think his work would also be of interest to you. And he defines it as the pursuit of two distinct disciplines of fitness that do not directly support one another. The way he words it might be slightly different from that, so I don't want to put words in his mouth, but that's pretty much the gist of it. So most commonly, this manifests in some type of strength pursuit and some type of endurance pursuit. You can imagine that strength and mobility as simultaneous goals would also kind of fit the bill, but mobility you only really are going to take so far. You don't really need your ankle, need your head, whereas the room for progress with endurance and strength and muscle growth and things like that are much longer. So those tend to make the kind of more stereotypical combination of goals there. And now the term directly support one another is intentional insofar that you can imagine that strength training can be beneficial to something like running in terms of increased running economy, increased bone mineral density, things like that. And some degree of cardiovascular training can be helpful for strength training for the purposes of improved recovery, things like that. But doing cardio for the sake of supplementing your strength training or vice versa is a bit of a different concept than what hybrid training is meant to be. In hybrid training, you're really doing each of those for the sake of improving both of those, not for the sake of supplementing the other. And then as I view it, and this is going to be a bit more of a kind of, let's say, pertinent point when we talk about how this differs from something like CrossFit. In hybrid training, you're ideally going to pick one specific strength or related goal. And when I say strength, that could mean muscle growth, that could mean power, things like that, and one specific endurance goal. And you're going to sort of pair those within a given program. You don't have to pick those for the rest of your life, but ideally within, let's say, 1 4-month program or so, that there's going to be two distinct goals like that are paired. It could be you're trying to improve your clean and jerk and your 5K. It could mean powerlifting and triathlon. It could mean, half marathon and bodybuilding. Whatever those two goals are, ideally there's going to be, distinct labels for each one. And as I note here, there's lots of room for creativity here. There's no right answer for what two goals you combine. You can combine whatever you want. You can change that over time. And, let's say, for example, for the beginning of the year, for the first 3-4 months of the year, that your goals revolve around bodybuilding type goals, like muscle growth goals and running. And then after that, you go into a phase where you want to pursue powerlifting more so. You can imagine that the muscle growth portion, that initial kind of start to the year, is going to benefit the powerlifting. It's not like you're starting from scratch every time you change goals like this. However, nevertheless, to summarize this slide, really the main idea behind hybrid training is that you're going to pick two distinct fitness goals that do not directly support one another and pursue those simultaneously. In regard to what you might call the benefits of hybrid training, in my view, there's really three things that are worth bringing up here. So exercise is healthy, real mind-blowing point there. But one of the things I wanted to bring up with this bullet point here is that some of the health benefits from strength training are unique to strength training, and there are health benefits from endurance training that are unique to endurance training. Now, there's a great deal of overlap, but certain aspects of health outcomes are going to be maximized from endurance training, and some are going to be maximized from strength training. And a very common theme that you'll see in a lot of the research looking at exercise and different types of exercise in regard to long-term health outcomes is that strength training and endurance training as isolated interventions tend to be pretty close. I think it's a very hard thing to say one is inherently healthier than the other, but the combination of which tends to be just that much higher than either of which in isolation. And a lot of times, so for instance, something like blood lipid panels tend to be more benefited by endurance training than strength training. But the pattern of improvement that you'll see in your blood lipid panels from concurrent strength and endurance training is pretty much the same sort of pattern that you'll see from endurance training alone, but to a greater magnitude. And that's what I mean when I say that the combination of which is just that much better than either of which in isolation. And I mean, past that, the idea of how exercise impacts health outcomes, we could be here 10 hours going over all the various points. So, that's kind of the main thing I wanted to get across there with this point. Another benefit of hybrid training that I think is worth breaking up is variety in your trainings. It certainly is the case that too much variety and doing something different every week can definitely be a real hinder on your progress long term. But due to the nature of hybrid training, kind of what we talked about before, and how you're kind of picking two distinct goals at a time and pursuing those, within a given program, and that those can change over time, that is going to inherently have a good bit of variety. And also, how you train for something like endurance and something like strength training are going to look very different. And so the types of training and types of exercises you do are going to look very different. It's going to be hard for that to get stale, for lack of a better word. And then lastly, your relationship with training, I think, is worth bringing up. So much of the fitness industry is solely predicated on looks. And in my view, hybrid training kind of forces you to be a bit more performance oriented. And in my experience, and this is purely anecdotal in this bullet point, it's not like I have hard data to really support this, but in my experience working with people, and even I'll say with myself, that this can help ward off some of the things like the emotional roller coaster with training, body dysmorphia, things of that nature. So next point, can anyone do hybrid training? And really, I mean, this is kind of the main point, this yes right here. Because like we talked about, hybrid training is just the simultaneous pursuit of one endurance goal and one strength training goal. Most commonly, it can be other things, but like we said, that's kind of the most common manifestation. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to do each at the highest level possible and train 24/7 or anything like that. I mean, you can most certainly do structured exercise 3 times per week and have that be hybrid in nature, and call yourself a hybrid athlete for all intents and purposes. I forget the name exactly, but I believe it was one of the founders or co-founders of Nike who has the quote that says, "If you have a body, you're an athlete." And that's something that I am on board with 100%. I hate this gatekeeping of fitness where people say like, "Oh, you're not a real athlete unless you do something at the highest level possible." And certainly, people vary in how athletic they are. But if you are doing structured exercise on a regular basis, whether that's 3 days per week, 7 days per week, twice a day, whatever it is, and you're improving over time, why the fuck not call yourself an athlete? That's kind of a bit of a tangent from what the purpose of this slide was meant to be. But yes, overall, anyone can do hybrid training because at the end of the day, all it is just a split focus between endurance and strength as opposed to solely focusing on one another or one or the other. And it's a free country. Anyone can do this. So a lot of the sort of self-proclaimed hybrid athletes on social media, you'll see training twice a day. Most of them will sort of post stuff like that. And these are people who usually just really love to train. And I think that's more so why. But you don't need to, by any stretch of the imagination. The required dose for improvements in both strength and endurance are not so that high to require twice per day of training. For instance, the absolute minimum required dose of strength training to see progress in muscle growth over time, and this is data, I'll cite the paper below, but data even in trained athletes, seems to be 4 sets per week. More tends to be better, but there are diminishing returns over time as you do more. But I mean, you don't need to train twice per week or twice per day to hit 4 sets per week. Almost all of the clients that I coach have some degree of strength and endurance goals, not all of which are perfectly 50-50, because that's another thing. You could have a 70% strength focus and 30% endurance focus. I mean, it's very, the slider scale is very customizable in that way. But many of which I have doing, let's say anywhere between 6 to 12 sets per week per muscle group, and most of which are not training. Some are, but most of which are not training twice per day. Now, with endurance, there certainly is a bit of more of an emphasis on volume, I would say, where volume is going to tend to drive a lot of the results you see, but you can still see great results for a long time with just 3 endurance sessions per week. More certainly can be better. I'll say that, but you don't necessarily need to always maximize everything to the absolute possible nth degree. And I did mention this before, but you can train, like I said, 3 times per week total. And if your split is just somewhere between close to halfway between strength and endurance, then you can call that hybrid training 100%. So the main difference between hybrid training and CrossFit, at least as I see it, kind of goes back to how I said, ideally you would pick one specific strength goal, one specific endurance goal. And again, like I said, that strength could be, muscle growth, power, like Olympic lifting, jump, sprint, whatever. Point is that with hybrid training, there is some degree of specificity as opposed in regard to what you are pursuing within each respective discipline. CrossFit, you tend to train every aspect of fitness equally. So you might be training strength, power, muscle growth, high intensity conditioning, low intensity conditioning, and everything else you can name. So that's what I would say the main difference between hybrid training and CrossFit. They certainly can, at face value look and sound a lot like one another, but I would say they are different in that regard. And just to be clear, I mean, that's not meant to be a knock on CrossFit at all. It's just, I just say that to point out the difference between the two. So I'm not going to spend too much time here because I do have a whole other article and video talking about the interference effect and the most recent systematic review and meta-analysis that looked at this. But basically, there is no inherent interference effect on either. Let me back up. The interference effect basically refers to the idea that cardio will inherently inhibit gains in muscle growth or strength, and vice versa. Most commonly, it's talked about cardio inhibiting strength, but that's kind of the historical late 90s, early 2000s kind of idea. Most of the, I would say more current research suggests that the sheer presence of cardiovascular training is not going to inhibit your strength training. And so what I mean by that is, let's say you are doing 3 full body strength workouts per week. And let's say in one scenario, you're doing that as your own. That's it. That's the only kind of training you're doing. And in the other, you're doing 2 to 3 days per week of some kind of endurance training. As long as you're eating and you're sleeping enough, there is no real evidence to say that the sheer presence of that endurance training is going to have an inhibitory effect on your strength training. Now, the one way I think you can say that there is some degree of an interference effect is in regard to opportunity cost. So, kind of as we talked about before, there is some degree of a volume dependency for both strength or muscle growth, strength training, let's say, and endurance training, certainly more so for endurance training, but both to some degree. And volume, of all the variables you can manipulate in a training program, volume is going to be the one that's most closely tied to the amount of time you spend training. And 45 minutes of endurance training means 45 minutes spent not strength training. So I think you can say that there is some degree of an interference effect in that regard, in the sense that there's only 24 hours in a day. But again, also, as we talked about a bit earlier, that, once you hit that minimum effective dose for either discipline, doing more tends to yield better results, but at a diminishing return. So in other words, going from 4 sets per week per muscle group in strength training to 6 sets per week is going to yield a greater absolute magnitude of benefit than going from 6 to 8, even though the increase was the same. So if you are interested in absolutely maximizing the results you see in either one, whether that's endurance or strength, then, hybrid training might not be the most opportune way to go about that. But in my view, you could get, let's say, 80 to 90% of your potential in either one if you do both. Because again, a lot of the benefit is found earlier on in the volume accumulation, and then there's a diminishing effect with doing more. So yes, there is an opportunity cost, but I think take it with a grain of salt. And as I say here, I do have, other resources on this topic. So I will link that down below if you want a deeper dive into this specific area of a study. And I just realized that this is the last slide I have. So hopefully you found this somewhat interesting or helpful, or, somewhere between. And if you have found yourself interested in this kind of training philosophy, I hope that this, gives you some better information as to if it's something you want to pursue. Any sort of comments, questions, concerns, anything like that, you can comment down below and I will get back to you as soon as I possibly can. And I will see you next time.